That day, Henry Thompson, with 75 years of memories and battles etched into his skin, was deep in thought, observing the café around him. The sound of laughter and conversations filled the air, creating a stark contrast to the quiet calm Henry carried in his gaze. The coffee in his hands, now cold, was more a companion than a drink. But something in the atmosphere felt different, a tension he couldn't quite explain. Have you ever felt that moment when everything seems normal, yet there's a lingering unease, a silent warning? What would you do if the shadow of a problem approached, unaware it was meant for you? Henry, waiting for his son, would soon discover that time can play tricks even a lifetime of experience cannot foresee. When the door opened, he had no idea that what crossed the threshold was not just another ordinary customer. The glances around the cafe began to shift discreetly toward the trio, a mixture of curiosity and unease hanging in the air. Laughter and conversation started to dwindle, as if a shadow had dimmed the lively glow of the place. Henry, clad in a worn coat and hands weathered by hard labor, was no stranger to tense moments like these, but age had brought him more wisdom than haste. He looked at the officers with the composure of someone who had weathered far greater storms. Want more inspiring videos? Subscribe to the channel and don't miss out. Officer Daniels, with a stern expression and clenched jaw, took a step closer, narrowing the space between them. "You say you're waiting for someone, but you don't seem to fit in here, old man," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. The provocation was clear, but Henry knew that responding with anger would only give the officer exactly what he wanted. He took a deep breath, letting the cafe's cold, charged air steady his quickening pulse. "I'm waiting for my son. He's come to pick me up," Henry replied, holding the officer's gaze. The firmness in his voice contrasted with the vulnerability he felt inside, a mix of apprehension and helplessness against a prejudice he had known for far too long. Carter laughed again, a dry, mocking laugh that cut through the tense silence of the room. "And where is he then, huh? Did he leave you here to get lost?" His question felt more like a taunt than a genuine inquiry. Before Henry could respond, the cafe door opened again. A tall young man with dark skin and short hair entered hastily, scanning the room until his eyes landed on his father, surrounded by police officers. It was James, his face a mixture of surprise and concern. The tension in the room intensified, the heavy silence making every word sound like a stone dropped into a deep well. Henry looked at the officers with a calm expression, but his trembling fingers betrayed the whirlwind of emotions inside him. The hand that still held his ID card remained steady, a small act of defiance against the humiliation they sought to impose. Years of life had taught him that staying calm in moments like these was a silent protest, an act of resistance in itself. "This idea is real," Henry said, his voice low but resolute, carrying the weight of decades of struggle. He knew that these words, spoken with dignity, posed a threat to the narrative Daniels and Carter wanted to sustain. But the irritation on the officers' faces was a warning that the confrontation was far from over. Support the channel with just one click. Subscribe and help our community grow. Daniels stepped closer, enough for Henry to catch the strong scent of cigarettes clinging to his uniform. "Don't give me stories, old man," he spat. "You think a piece of paper is enough to make you belong here? To pretend you're someone important?" The room, once filled with curious silence, was now heavy with discomfort. Some customers averted their eyes, unwilling to get involved, while others watched with expressions of concern and disbelief. James, who had lingered by the door, moved quickly as he sensed the hostility escalating. He knew his father could defend himself with words, but the moment called for more. He walked with firm steps, drawing the officer's attention. "This man is my father, and he has more right to be here than any of us," James said, his voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. James' eyes reflected a mix of anger and protection, his words carrying the weight of every sacrifice Henry had made, of every battle fought and won. Carter looked at James, startled by his intervention. But before he could respond, Daniel's expression hardened even more. He found himself in an unplanned dilemma, a situation spiraling out of his control. Henry's gaze fixed on Daniels, not with fear, but with a mix of weariness and quiet courage. He knew his entire life had been a sequence of battles, some won, others lost, but all fought with dignity. His heart pounded in his chest, but his hands, now firmly on the table, were steady. Henry understood that any sudden move could trigger something far worse. James, seeing the scene unfold, stepped forward and spoke with a firm but measured tone. "You need to stop." This man served his country, dedicating his life to the freedom we all enjoy now. His voice resonated in the cafe like a call to conscience. For a moment, time seemed to freeze as everyone turned their attention to the officers, waiting for their next move. But Daniels, driven by wounded pride and a need to maintain authority, ignored James' warning. He stepped closer to Henry, his hand hovering near the belt where his weapon hung. "I said leave," he repeated, his tone leaving no doubt that he was ready to act. At that moment, an older woman seated nearby, with white hair and glasses perched on the tip of her nose, stood up. Her voice, thin yet filled with conviction, sliced through the tension like a knife. "Enough! You're not going to intimidate this man without cause." Her statement caught everyone off guard, including the officers. For the first time, the silence in the cafe was broken by a collective murmur, a subtle shift as people began to show solidarity. "Your support matters. Subscribe now." Daniels glanced around, realizing the situation was slipping out of his control in ways he hadn't anticipated. His initial confidence faltered, replaced by a tense expression. Time seemed to stretch, and the sound of a cup falling to the floor somehow brought everyone back to the present. The silence in the cafe was so dense it seemed to absorb even the breaths of those present. Henry kept his gaze fixed on Daniels, feeling every muscle in his body on high alert but controlled. He had faced enough adversity in his life to know that sometimes the strongest resistance was silence, the steadfast presence of someone who refused to be broken. James watched closely, his heart pounding in his chest. Sweat began to form on James's forehead as he struggled to calculate his next move. He knew that acting rashly could escalate the situation, but he also understood that his father wouldn't leave without a show of respect. And at that moment, respect was the only thing Henry could still claim. Daniels, realizing Henry wouldn't back down, stepped even closer. The tension was palpable, each passing second ticking towards something unpredictable. "Old man, I'm serious. This is your last chance," Daniels repeated, but now with a hint of uncertainty in his voice. The silent presence of the other customers was beginning to weigh on him. This was no longer a private act of intimidation. It had become a public scene, forcing him to rethink his next move. That's when James finally broke the silence. "If someone's leaving, it'll be the two of us," he said, stepping closer to his father and placing a firm hand on his shoulder. The gesture was both one of support and protection. Henry's eyes filled with a mixture of pride and relief as he looked at his son standing by his side. The act broke the tension, stirring murmurs among the customers, who exchanged glances of approval and relief. Daniels took a slight step back, clearly unprepared for this display of unity and defiance. Carter glanced around, realizing that any misstep could turn into an unwelcome headline. The balance of power in the cafe had shifted. What had started as a stage for intimidation was now becoming a platform for peaceful resistance. As the seconds passed, everyone waited to see what would happen next. The scrape of a chair echoed through the cafe like a gunshot, breaking the fragile silence. Henry, forced to stand, kept his shoulders straight and his expression calm. At that moment, he was more than just a man facing humiliation. He was the embodiment of every battle he had fought and every sacrifice he had made for a country that still struggled to recognize his dignity. James, with clenched fists, moved to stand beside his father, anger blazing in his eyes. "You have no right to treat him this way," James declared, his voice trembling with indignation. For a moment, Daniels hesitated, surprised by James's boldness. But the hesitation quickly turned into a sarcastic smile. He wanted to maintain control, but now he felt the weight of the customers' stares. People who had been engrossed in their own affairs were now witnessing a scene that made them question their own limits of tolerance. Carter, who had maintained a more restrained demeanor, tugged on Daniels' arm. "Enough," he muttered, though it sounded more like an attempt to avoid a scandal than a show of empathy. Daniels ignored him, still determined to assert his unquestioned authority. "This place isn't for you," he said, addressing both Henry and James. His words were cold, steeped in a prejudice that refused to fade. Henry took a deep breath and locked eyes with Daniels, his expression both defiant and resigned. "I've fought wars for this country so men like you can wear that badge without fear. And yet, here we are," he said, his voice low but laden with an undeniable truth. A murmur spread through the customers, some finally moved by Henry's courage. A young woman, who had been silently watching with wide eyes, stood and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Leave him alone. You can't do this." The effect was immediate. The café seemed to awaken from a trance, and more people began to speak up, murmuring and casting accusatory glances at the officers. Daniels, realizing he had lost control of the situation, finally stepped back, his look of fury replaced by one of bitter resentment. Carter followed, seeming more relieved than frustrated. The power dynamic in that moment had shifted, not through force, but through the dignity of a man who refused to yield. Henry remained standing, with James by his side, as the café began to breathe again. The tension slowly dissipated, but no one would forget what they had just witnessed. The silence transformed into a soft murmur, and while the officers began to retreat, the feeling of solidarity and resistance lingered in the air. As Henry's hat fell to the floor, it seemed like the final drop in a sea of injustices. The silence that followed was sharp, a moment when everyone waited for anything to happen. James stepped forward, but Henry's firm hand on his arm stopped him. The veteran, who had endured more than most could imagine, stood unmoving. His body was rigid, but his eyes burned with a mix of indignation and pain that only he could express without words. "Enough," Henry said, his voice low, but carrying an authority honed through years of discipline and resilience. For a moment, Daniels hesitated, as if he felt the power in that single word. The authority of the badge and uniform was dwarfed by the strength of the man standing before him, unyielding in the face of anger and fear. Carter, shifting uneasily, glanced at the hat on the floor, and for an instant, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. But it was too late. The mistreatment of Henry had already gone too far to be ignored. A middle-aged woman with her hair tied in a bun and reading glasses hanging from her neck stood from her table and picked up the hat. She handed it to Henry with a look of silent solidarity and a slight nod. "This man deserves respect," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a conviction that rippled through the room. The murmurs in the café grew louder. More people began to stand, casting defiant looks at the officers. Social pressure had now turned against Daniels and Carter. Daniels realized the situation was slipping beyond his control. His fingers twitched in frustration. "Let's go," he muttered to Carter, his voice hardened by wounded pride. Carter cast one last glance at Henry and the small crowd, now visibly aligned with the veteran. They stepped away from the table, their expressions still carrying the bitterness of defied authority. James bent down, righted the fallen chair, and helped his father sit down slowly. The atmosphere began to settle into an uneasy normalcy. Yet nothing would be forgotten. Not by the old soldier, whose bones bore the weight of experience, nor by the customers who had witnessed a struggle far deeper than a simple café confrontation. The room seemed frozen in time, every face reflecting the disbelief and anguish of witnessing such injustice. James's heart pounded wildly as his hands trembled with frustration, watching his father treated like a criminal without cause. He stepped forward again, but Henry's outstretched hand, a subtle gesture of calm, held him back. The veteran, even as pain radiated through his arm, remained composed. "Let my father go. Now," James said, his voice firm and brimming with a determination that brooked no argument. The room seemed to exhale in response, as if his words had unlocked something in everyone's hearts. Daniels glared at James with disdain, but for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. An older man, sitting in a corner with a forgotten newspaper on his table, stood and slammed his fist on the table. The sound reverberated through the cafe. "Enough! This is inhumane." His trembling but firm voice echoed through the space, reflecting what many had wanted to say but feared to express. Carter, who had thus far maintained a composed demeanor, let out a visible sigh. He knew things had gone too far. The murmurs of the other customers were becoming clearer, evolving into audible voices of support. "Let him go!" Someone shouted from the back of the cafe, and that voice was quickly joined by others, creating a chorus that challenged the officer's authority. Daniels, still gripping Henry's arm, glanced around and realized the tide had shifted. The defiant look in Henry's eyes, once just a lone act of silent resistance, was now bolstered by dozens of pairs of eyes that no longer looked away. The social pressure was overwhelming, and Daniels knew the only way out without greater consequences was to release the veteran. With a sharp, reluctant motion, Daniels let go of Henry's arm. Slowly, Henry withdrew it, massaging his sore wrist. The old soldier looked at the officer with an expression that was a mix of pain and a dignity no uniform could erase. The room was still simmering with latent tension, everyone waiting for what would happen next. Henry straightened his posture, ignoring the pain and humiliation, and glanced at James, who now stood beside him, ready to protect his father at any cost. The veteran understood that this moment was no longer just about him. It was about resilience and reminding everyone that a man's dignity could not be forcibly taken. At that moment, he was no longer alone. The metallic click of handcuffs locking around Henry's wrist reverberated through the cafe like a blow, striking not only the old soldier, but also the collective conscience of everyone silently watching. James felt a knot tighten in his chest, anger and helplessness building within him. He knew his father didn't deserve this, that no human being deserved to be treated this way, especially a man who had dedicated his life to serving a country now showing him contempt. Henry kept his head high, even as the tight cuffs began to throb against his wrists. His eyes, steadfast and full of history, locked onto Daniels. "Is this what you call justice?" he asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion, yet brimming with a courage that seemed to unsettle the officer. Daniels, however, didn't respond. Instead, he yanked Henry forward, causing the veteran to stumble momentarily before regaining his balance. The silence dominating the cafe was interrupted by an unexpected sound. A young customer in a delivery uniform shouted, "This is wrong. You can't do this." His declaration sparked a wave of murmurs and voices rising in support, as people who had previously been too afraid to speak found courage in the stranger's words. The atmosphere transformed into a blend of indignation and solidarity with the man who, only moments ago, had been just another quiet customer. James stepped forward, his voice firm with determination. "You're not taking my father without justification. He's a veteran, a hero, and everyone here knows it." Once again, his words echoed through the cafe, and more customers stood, forming a symbolic wall of solidarity around Henry. Carter glanced around, visibly uncomfortable. The situation had escalated into something far bigger than he or Daniels could control. The growing chorus of voices gained strength, and Daniels, now fully aware he was on the verge of inciting a revolt, hesitated. Despite the handcuffs, Henry looked at his son, a tired but proud smile forming on his lips. His defiance had ignited something in these people. In that moment, he was no longer just a man facing injustice. He was the embodiment of a much larger fight. The air in the cafe seemed to thicken, suffocating everyone present as the officers digested the revelation stamped on the small ID card. Daniels, who had previously worn an air of unshakable superiority, now appeared paralyzed, his face draining of color as the truth hit him. Carter, halfway through dragging Henry, froze, his eyes darting between the ID card, the veteran, and Daniels, as though waiting for instructions to undo the irreversible. Henry's gaze remained steady, even with the handcuffs biting into his pride. This moment, humiliating as it was, wasn't new to him. He had faced men like Daniels and Carter before, different faces, same attitudes. Yet he had endured. No! He had done more than endure. He had thrived. He had survived the horrors of war. Carrying scars in his bones from battles fought in distant jungles and familiar streets where the fight for dignity was unrelenting. James, noticing the abrupt shift in the officer's demeanor, narrowed his eyes, refusing to lower his guard. The tension in the room oscillated between astonishment and anticipation as the other customers watched, waiting for a response. Some faces already showed recognition. The name Commissioner Thompson began to echo in their memories, forming a clearer picture in their minds. Daniels, awkwardly trying to regain composure, trembled as he held the ID card. The weight of his actions, now fully understood, made his hands shake. Words failed him. His mind, so quick to devise ways to subdue others, was now silent. Finally he muttered, I didn't know. Henry stared back, without a trace of relief. The veteran didn't need Daniels' pity. He wanted respect. You never do, he replied, his tone carrying decades of experience and suffering, but also immense strength. Henry glanced at his son, then at the broken pieces of his cane on the floor. It was a symbolic pain, as if part of his own story had been split in two. Yet he remained resolute. The café, once a stage for cowardly acts, had become the setting for an unforeseen turn no one could have predicted. Carter, desperate for a less shameful exit, stepped back, releasing Henry's arm as the sound of whispered voices filled the air. It was clear that nothing would ever be the same. Even after all the humiliation, Henry Thompson continued to inspire resilience in everyone present. More than ever, his example of dignity under pressure would leave an unbreakable legacy. Henry's mind drifted to moments only he could recall, echoes of a youth lost in trenches and distant explosions, where the sound of war was as deafening as the silence that followed. That vacant stare now had a greater purpose, a story that the officers before him couldn't even begin to comprehend. To Daniels and Carter, he was just an old man, a face among many. But to those who knew his history, he was much more. The battlefields of Vietnam, where Henry witnessed death repeatedly, had forged in him a resilience that no scornful look or disdainful gesture could ever erase. He had carried wounded comrades under enemy fire, risked his own life on missions that defied logic, and, against all odds, survived. In the heat of battle, his actions weren't judged by the color of his skin but by the bravery of his deeds. The bonds forged there were so deep they transcended the divisions that the civilian world stubbornly insisted on maintaining. But returning to his homeland brought a cold, bitter awakening. He walked the streets of his city with medals stored in a cardboard box, never using them as a shield. No matter how much he had sacrificed in America, he was a black man first and foremost. Recognition for his bravery was swallowed by the prejudice poisoning every interaction. Yet that didn't stop him from moving forward. Henry found a loving partner and built a family that was his pride and joy. He taught Robert the values of integrity and courage, knowing they would be tested at every moment in his son's life. Watching Robert rise to become a police commissioner was a silent victory for Henry, a glimmer of hope in a world that still seemed so hostile. Raising his son in an environment filled with barriers and seeing him overcome them was proof that a lifetime of effort had been worthwhile. What Henry didn't know, as he stood handcuffed and humiliated in that cafe, was that the legacy of resilience he had instilled in Robert was about to change everything. Daniels, now fully aware of the magnitude of his mistake, swallowed hard. The arrogance that had once been etched on his face was now stripped away, leaving him devoid of any confidence. Carter, standing beside him, looked around at the increasingly oppressive environment. The name Thompson weighed like a rock on both their shoulders. The sound of a door opening drew every gaze in the room. It was Robert, the commissioner, with an expression that blended surprise and fury as he took in the sight of his father in such a state. Henry met his son's eyes, and in that brief moment, no words were needed. Robert understood everything. The weight of the moment grew heavier with each passing second. Henry felt the marks from the handcuffs on his wrists, a discomfort that wasn't just physical but laden with symbolism. He stood tall, watching as Daniels and Carter crumbled under the weight of guilt and collective judgment. The officers' expressions were a mix of panic and regret, but it wasn't empathy shining in their eyes. It was fear of the inevitable consequences. Daniels, unable to maintain his composure, kept murmuring incoherent apologies, each word weaker than the last. We didn't know, sir. We had no idea." His voice trailed off as the cafe patrons, who had previously only observed, now recorded everything on their phones. The sound of clicks and recordings heightened the gravity of the situation. The cafe, once a space for laughter and everyday conversations, had transformed into the stage for a pivotal moment of justice and shame. Carter, for his part, couldn't even look at Henry. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. He could feel the piercing stares of everyone judging them openly now, and cold sweat ran down his temple. The confidence he had once exuded so easily had evaporated, replaced by the harsh reality that their actions wouldn't be forgiven or forgotten. Henry, however, didn't need to speak. The calm he had maintained throughout the incident now served as a silent condemnation of the two men. The name written on the ID, Commissioner Thompson, hovered over them like a glaring reminder of their colossal mistake. It was more than just a name. It was proof they had crossed a line they should never have approached. The sound of another door opening drew everyone's attention to the back of the cafe, where Robert Thompson's imposing figure entered. His pristine uniform reflected the light streaming in through the window, and his expression was a mix of restrained anger and sorrow at seeing his father in such a state. The silence deepened, and the air seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Phones continued recording, and the eyes of the cafe patrons flicked between Robert and the officers. "Dad, are you okay?" Robert asked, his voice firm but tinged with concern. Henry looked into his son's eyes, and for the first time that day, a small, meaningful smile appeared on his face. He didn't need to respond. The mere fact that his son was there, standing up for his legacy, was answer enough. The silence in the cafe was absolute, charged with tension and expectation. The officers, now stripped of any trace of arrogance, shrank under the sharp gaze of Commissioner Robert Thompson. He didn't need to say anything for the weight of his presence to make Daniels and Carter recoil further. The air seemed to hum with the restrained energy of a bomb about to go off, as the customer's eyes darted between the commissioner and the officers. Robert stopped beside his father, looking at the handcuffs still marking Henry's aged wrists. The commissioner took a deep breath, working to contain the mix of anger and sadness boiling inside him. With a quick, deliberate motion, he grabbed the handcuff key from Carter, whose trembling hands could barely hold it. Unlocking the cuffs was an act that resonated with deep symbolism, a silent declaration that the injustice ended there. "Dad," Robert said, his voice low but filled with emotion. Henry looked at his son with a mix of pride and understanding. No words were necessary. The bond between them said everything. Henry raised his freed hands, massaging his marked wrists, and gave a slight nod of gratitude. Robert then turned to Daniels and Carter, his gaze now hard and unyielding. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked, his voice cold and sharp, cutting through the air of the cafe like a knife. Daniels tried to stammer out a response, but the words died in his throat. He knew that any attempt to justify his actions would be futile. Carter lowered his head, unable to meet the commissioner's eyes. Robert stepped forward, causing the two officers to instinctively retreat. You abused your authority, humiliated a veteran who served this country, and above all, proved that you don't deserve to wear that uniform. His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Some of the customers watching the scene nodded silently in agreement. The weight of the moment was undeniable. Henry watched with a calm expression, but his heart pounded in his chest. He knew justice would be served. More than that, he knew his son's actions were living proof that the values he had instilled had not been in vain. Robert continued, his voice firm, but now tinged with disappointment. You will answer for this, not just as police officers, but as men who failed to respect the dignity of another human being. The atmosphere, previously charged with tension, began to ease as the truth unfolded before everyone's eyes. The customers witnessing this moment understood they were seeing more than just a reprimand. They were watching justice take its course and Henry's dignity being restored, not just by his son, but by everyone who learned, that day, the true meaning of respect and humanity. The café was immersed in complete silence as Commissioner Robert Thompson spoke. His words carried a weight that came not just from his authority, but from the integrity of a man who understood what was right. Henry's face, though marked by time and experience, showed an almost impenetrable calm. He knew the lesson being taught in that moment went beyond his personal case. It was a message for everyone present. Daniels and Carter exchanged glances, desperately searching for a way out of their humiliating situation. Their weak and disconnected apologies found no echo, not even among the customers who continued to watch, some with their phones in hand, recording every moment. Commissioner Robert, still with a stern expression, silenced the officer's murmurs with a simple gesture. Do you think not knowing who he is justifies what you did? Every human being deserves respect, and the uniform you wear should represent that. His voice wasn't raised, but each word landed like a hammer. Henry Thompson served his country in times of war. He fought for an ideal that, ironically, you disgrace today. But even if he didn't have that past, what you did would still be wrong. Robert looked around, ensuring that everyone understood the depth of his statement. Respect is not something to be given out of obligation or fear, but because it is the right thing to do. Carter's eyes began to fill with tears, not of empathy, but of the realization that consequences were now inevitable and necessary. Daniels, with no escape, stood rigid, but the sweat streaming down his face betrayed his attempt to appear unfazed. Henry, standing beside his son, placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. The simple gesture carried immense emotional weight. It was a silent acknowledgement that, despite the pain and humiliation, he wasn't alone in this fight. This moment was more than the restoration of his dignity. It was a reminder that, despite all the challenges, he had raised a man who knew what was right and was willing to fight for it. "Thank you, son," Henry murmured, his voice low, but loud enough for Robert to hear. Robert nodded, his eyes softening for a brief moment before returning his focus to the officers. "You will be held accountable for your actions," he concluded, closing the moment with a promise of justice. The café, which had borne witness to humiliation and the restoration of dignity, seemed to breathe again. The customers present, now part of a collective memory that would resonate in the community, understood they had witnessed something far greater than a reprimand. A lesson in respect, strength, and resilience, embodied in the figure of a veteran who refused to be broken. The silence following the officer's exit was different from the one that had dominated the café minutes earlier. Now, it was a silence of relief, almost of reverence. The gazes, once filled with curiosity and fear, now turned to Henry and Robert with newfound understanding. They were not just a veteran and a commissioner. They were father and son, united by a story of resilience and triumph. Robert took his father's hands, careful not to aggravate the marks and scars that bore testament to a life of perseverance. The sound of the handcuffs hitting the table felt like a symbol of liberation, resonating in the hearts of everyone present. Henry flexed his wrists and smiled faintly, not with arrogance, but with the serenity of a man who knew he had won another battle and was not alone. "I'm sorry about this, Dad," Robert said, his voice now softer and tinged with pain. He felt a mix of pride and sorrow seeing the man who had taught him so much endure such a degrading situation. Henry, however, shook his head slowly, signaling that no apology was necessary. "It's not your fault, son," he replied, his voice carrying a wisdom that transcended the moment. "The world has a way of testing us, but it only makes us stronger." The veteran looked around, observing faces that now seemed to understand him in a way that hadn't been possible before. The space, once a scene of injustice, had transformed into a symbol of resistance and dignity. Robert sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing for a moment. He knew this incident was more than an isolated event. It was a reminder that the struggles Henry had faced throughout his life still resonated, but it was also evidence of progress, however small. The solidarity shown by the customers, the murmurs now turning into words of support and understanding, indicated that Henry's example had not gone unnoticed. The young woman who had earlier picked up Henry's cane approached, carefully holding the broken pieces. "Mr. Thompson, I'm so sorry for what happened," she said, handing him the pieces with a look of respect. Henry took the broken cane and studied it for a moment before responding. "Thank you," he said, his voice firm. The object, though broken, represented a strength that had never been lost. Looking at his son, he knew the next generation would continue the fight, but with more allies and fewer obstacles. That afternoon, the cafe was no longer just a place to pass through. It became a place where a lesson on honor, respect, and the importance of standing against injustice was learned. The silence between father and son was not empty. It was filled with emotions and an understanding that went beyond words. Commissioner Robert Thompson looked at the man before him, recalling all the stories Henry had shared about his life, from the battlefields of Vietnam to the long days of hard work and perseverance. Robert had always admired his father's resilience, but that day, seeing the unshakable dignity with which he endured humiliation, that admiration deepened even more. "Dad, I'll make sure this never happens again. I'll personally handle Daniels and Carter, and changes will be made," Robert promised, his voice laden with guilt and determination. Henry only smiled, a smile that carried years of experience and an acceptance that life, despite its challenges, was always a battle to be faced with one's head held high. "I know, son," Henry replied, his voice deep and reassuring. "And that's what matters. You make the difference, not just for me, but for everyone still fighting these battles every day." He knew the fight for respect and equality was a long and winding road, but seeing his son in a position of leadership committed to justice gave him hope. The cafe, once a stage for fear and silence, now held a different kind of calm. Those around, some still holding their phones, watched the two men with newfound respect. It was a moment in which everyone seemed to absorb the significance of what had occurred, not just the humiliation, but the response, the dignity, and the commitment to change. Robert stepped toward his father and placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that conveyed not only support but recognition of the strength that had always guided their family. Henry nodded, and that brief connection was enough to say everything they needed to say to one another. "Let's go home," Robert said, his tone lighter but full of meaning. Henry nodded, rising with his son's help. The broken cane would be replaced, but the lesson of that day would remain forever. As they left the cafe, the crowd watched with respect, understanding they had witnessed something profound, a reminder that justice often begins with the courage of a man who refuses to bend and the integrity of another who defends what is right. News of the incident quickly spread throughout the city, transcending the walls of the cafe and resonating in every corner of the community. Stories were told and retold, painting the portrait of a veteran who faced injustice with unshakable dignity and a commissioner who refused to let dishonor go unpunished. The story of Henry Thompson, a man who had fought for his country and continued to fight for respect, became a symbol of resilience and change. The city's response was immediate and unified. Peaceful marches were organized in support of Henry, drawing people of all ages and backgrounds. Banners and signs with words like respect and justice for all were raised in a powerful demonstration of solidarity. Henry, who had always believed action spoke louder than words, was deeply moved to see so many people come together for a greater cause. Commissioner Thompson, true to the principles his father had instilled in him, acted swiftly and transparently. The internal investigation wasn't just a formality. It was a thorough examination that uncovered other questionable practices within the force. The suspension of Daniels and Carter, accompanied by mandatory training on bias and respect, was just the beginning of a broader reform. Under Robert's leadership, the department committed to implementing new policies that prioritize respect and equality in the treatment of all citizens, regardless of their background or skin color. The community, once divided by distrust and latent tensions, found a new point of unity in Henry's story and Robert's actions. The tale of the veteran who had fought battles both abroad and at home became an example that the fight for justice doesn't end. It continues with every act of courage and every display of integrity. For Henry, that day was a bitter reminder that the wounds of the past were not yet fully healed. But it was also proof that the seed he had planted in his son had grown stronger than he could have imagined. He saw in Robert the continuation of his own struggle, and felt a profound pride in raising a man who not only recognized injustice, but acted decisively to correct it. The city changed after that day. The echoes of the café incident served as a wake-up call, a reminder that everyone has a duty to stand against injustice, even if it means confronting their own peers. Henry knew that change was a slow and often painful process, but he also knew that every step mattered. And as he watched his community awaken and come together, he found renewed hope that future generations might inherit a world that was just a little fairer and more dignified. The news of the incident quickly spread across the city, transcending the walls of the cafe and resonating in every corner of the community. Stories were told and retold, painting a vivid portrait of a veteran who faced injustice with unyielding dignity and a commissioner who refused to let dishonor go unpunished. The story of Henry Thompson, a man who had fought for his country and continued to fight for respect, became a powerful symbol of resilience and change. The city's response was swift and unified. Peaceful marches were organized in support of Henry, drawing people of all ages and backgrounds. Signs and banners with words like respect and justice for all were raised in a demonstration of solidarity. Henry, who had always believed that action spoke louder than words, was deeply moved to see so many people coming together for a greater cause. Commissioner Thompson, true to the principles his father had instilled in him, acted quickly and transparently. The internal investigation was not a mere formality, but a thorough examination that brought to light other questionable practices within the force. The suspension of Daniels and Carter, along with mandatory training on bias and respect, was only the beginning of a broader reform. Under Robert's leadership, the department committed to implementing new guidelines, prioritizing respect and equality in the treatment of all citizens, regardless of their background or skin color. The community, once divided by distrust and latent tensions, found a new point of unity in Henry's story and the commissioner's stance. The tale of the veteran who had fought battles both abroad and at home became an enduring example that the fight for justice never truly ends. It continues in every act of courage and every display of integrity. For Henry, that day was a bitter reminder that the wounds of the past were not yet fully healed. But it was also proof that the seed he had planted in his son had grown stronger than he could have ever imagined. He saw in Robert the continuation of his own struggle and felt an overwhelming pride in having raised a man who not only recognized injustice, but acted decisively to correct it. The city changed after that day. The echoes of the cafe incident served as a wake-up call, a reminder that everyone has a duty to stand against injustice, even when it means confronting one's peers. Henry understood that change was a slow and often painful process, but he also knew that every step forward mattered. And as he watched his community awaken and unite, He found a renewed sense of hope that future generations might inherit a world just a little fairer and more dignified.